Welcome back, David. Gonna dig deeper in mitochondria talk. Uh, and to me, I wanted to dig deeper into almost origins of mitochondria. But we finished, you were talking about electromagnetic fields and all those kind of things. What would be the next step in understanding the importance of mitochondria in our life?
Yeah. So we kind of left the last episode talking about how it kind of just starts at the engines that are stars that create the life and how that trickles down to everything there is in the universe. I think we just kind of pick up from there to fully understand the engine that is mitochondria, like the transformer. Like it is an engine, right? Because engines just transform energy. You put diesel or petrol or whatever or electricity into an engine, it does mechanical work. You're not making new things. You're just transforming energy into potential. Mitochondria are experts at that. So let's talk a little bit about how they exploit that and how they're using magnetic fields and radiate, basically the things that exist in the universe, right? Because you got to understand, right? This kind of goes to like, how does life come to be, right? Now, I'm not trying to, tell you, as far as like religion and all of that, or whether you believe the earth is, this old or that old. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about if you're just, you know, hearing stories, whether it's in the Bible or other places, or reading literature, the history of Earth is a little bit nuts. So the one I'm going to stick with is, hey, the universe blew up, Earth is made. What? How does that even happen? That all of a sudden eventually there are humans on this thing, on this ride. And basically from what we do know, right, there are evidence of that, and we have geological evidence and scientific evidence around this particular history of events. What they tell you as far as how they happen, that's where I'm going to highlight something. So first things first, there isn't an atmosphere at first, right? And it's just heat and cold, all kind of like just like you would on the moon, right? There is no gradient, there is no atmosphere. That you're getting a crap ton of radiation if you're in the sun, and no radiation, and a whole bunch of cold if you're not in the sun, and a whole bunch of tectonic plate activity and all of that. The Earth is kind of like a blob. Right? It's not really doing anything as far as like what we know about it right now, as far as crusts, mantles, inner cores, that type. Like there's no layers, right? Nothing. Everything is just, for lack of a better way to say it, mixed up. Right? Everything's random. Right? There's no cohesion. There's no order. And then over a period of time, right, and with billions of years and whatnot, something starts to happen. Planet starts to make these things that I just described. Its inner core that's made mainly of iron, its outer core, the mantle, all of these things. The reason is because of physics, density, gravity, the pull of the earth. These things start to rotate and spin with the angular momentum. And next thing you know, the planet's making its magnetic field. Right? That's the start of when we start to see archaea and bacteria exist. There's no oxygen, right? There's just a magnetic field, right? So how is that? How are they doing that? And the way that they're doing that, what people have discovered is they're using metals. They're using elements that are in all of this molten surface of this blob, right? They're using things like iron, which is a lot of what the planet is. They're using things like magnesium. They're using things like copper. They're using a couple different atoms essentially off the periodic table that are paramagnetic, right? Molybdenum, manganese, iron, copper. Now, when I say those things, for most people, they don't mean anything other than maybe copper and copper wire, and you understand that it's conductive, and maybe that iron too. The other two, they don't really know anything about. But here's the thing: in your body, these four things do a lot of very important things. Iron is in your blood, and that's incredibly crucial for a lot of things that have to do with oxygen, which is a paramagnetic gas. Right? Just like iron is a paramagnetic metal. Right? It's very important to understand. There's magnetism here between the two, depending on north, south, and flip, and all of that. They do different things. Right? That's very useful when you're a bacteria or an archaea in ancient Earth with no oxygen, right? So there's no way to oxidize those. You can't burn fat. You can do some unique things with glucose if you set up this magnetic field control of these atoms. Why is that important? Because if a magnetic field can control these atoms, if you embed these atoms into tissues, now you can control tissues, right? The magnetic field can now control the atom controls the tissues, and depending on the structure that that tissue makes, you will make certain work out of it, right? That sounds a lot like, trying to make energy out of nothing, right? That sounds like transforming energy. You have a magnetic field, which is an energy, and depending on how it acts, you've sequestered a magnetic moment that moves around. When the magnetic field moves around, it flips states, it does some very unique things, and now you're tying it to something physical, a physical structure, a biological structure, like your bacterial membrane or et cetera, and now it's doing work, right? Now you can start mobilizing, energizing, and it gives you a little bit more capabilities with glucose. And that's essentially kind of where life sits for a long, long time. Ancient Earth looks like that. Right? There's books, a lot of books written on this with way more detail than I just described. One of them is called Power, Sex, and Suicide by, I think he's a chemist slash biologist. He's pretty famous in the mitochondrial world. Anyway, that's a book. Literally, that's the whole story. It's a very detailed story of this ancient Earth. This is what happens, and this is kind of what gets missed in that story in a way. They describe it, and history describes it as a great oxygenation event. Right? So Earth is in this ancient state that I just described. At some point in time, about 1 billion years ago, or somewhere in there, and I could be wrong in the exact number, but point being that at one point in time, boom, oxygen shoots up, and that leads from just bacteria and archaea existing into something unique where they form something new, which is a eukaryotic cell, which is an archaean outside cell and a bacteria inside cell. The bacteria inside cell becomes the mitochondria, and the outside cell is just a cell. And that whole thing, like two things become one thing, that's a eukaryotic cell. That is what a human cell is. That is what a mammal cell is. That is what complex life is. Okay. That happens at one point in time called the Great Oxygenation Event, where just life explodes because there's so much oxygen. In this book, they say it's the oxygen that contributes to that, right? Because of this parent. They don't give a lot of detail, which I'm disappointed in, but here's the parent. This is why. Oxygen is oxidative. That means it started killing the bacteria and the archaea, right? So they figured out a way, if we work together, that we can actually use this thing that's oxidizing us, it's setting us on fire. To oxidize, we're going to contain it like a nuclear reactor. We're going to contain that oxidation event in a mitochondria, and you're going to take care of the nuclear power plant and give us energy. Right? The reason the oxygen existed in the beginning, right? This is a paper that just came out last year, literally. It's because the magnetic field of the planet shot up. Remember what I said, the prior event of that? The magnetic field is just barely the planet's just barely starting to form layers. Right? It's barely starting to form its magnetic field. Eventually, true separation happens, a core solidifies, the core starts spinning its own thing, the mantles or the crust on the outside spins at a different rate, and now you have a dynamo, right? That's what a planet is when it has a magnetic field. And boom, the magnetic field strengthens to the strongest that it's ever been. What does a magnetic field do to paramagnetic things? It makes them move. It keeps them in on certain gradients, right? If you have a magnet, right, and you have a whole bunch of South Pole magnets, they're going to go to the south side of the most powerful magnet. Why am I saying that? That means that you're going to keep oxygen in the triple state, and you start to form an atmosphere. Because the magnetic moment, right? Oxygen is paramagnetic. Now you have a large magnetic field that the planet made. Boom, oxygen gets attracted to the surface. It stays closer to the surface. You start to form an atmosphere. Boom, you get the great oxygenation event. The magnetic field strengthening gave oxygen, but it also gave you even more control of paramagnetic things, which is what starts to develop as complex life. You can devote iron to blood so that it can hold oxygen in these different forms. That oxygen is superoxidative, so there's no mitochondria. Right? That's important to understand. No mitochondria in the blood. That's a unique thing because of what you're doing with the blood through this paramagnetic oxygen and paramagnetic iron. And then you start to understand, oh, the mitochondria adapted because they're not regular bacteria. They put paramagnetic iron and sulfur, and we'll have diagrams and all of this, right? We won't get into a lot of detail on this. And the point being, the mitochondria develop because the magnetic field gets strong and continues to move on, make complex life. So that event causes the right type of light to filter through the atmosphere, the right type of magnetic field to exist, and the right type of water through the atmospheric water cycle of the planet to exist so that life takes hold. So in other words, life requires the right type of light, the right type of magnetic field, the right type of water being created inside your cells because of how this engine is put together. Does that make, like, I know that was a lot, right? So if you want to kind of or whatever.
Yeah, and it's I think it's almost kind of crucial to add that temperature is very important here as well, right? But that magnetic field is protecting us from the difference between sun being really, really good for us and really, really poisonous.
Correct.
You know?
Yes. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, right? Because in the ancient, right, there's something, I'm glad that you mentioned the cold, right? Because the cold, right? Why does cold work in us for all the things that it works for, right? All the studies that you're finding about cold, it's because of the archaea and the bacteria before there was oxygen. Remember what I said? They're dealing with lots of radiation, no oxygen, and complete cold when the planet turns away from it. They learned to exploit temperature gradients and radiation. In fact, I'm glad that you asked this. Because they learned to exploit temperature gradients and radiation, you have the evolution of the first complex life. The first eukaryote is fungus. It makes a ton of melanin because of the adaptations of the archaea and the bacteria on radiation. The melanin is a radiation eater. If you want evidence for that, that's also recent evidence. In Chernobyl, we have evidence that fungus is growing inside the reactor there and eating the radiation. This is not new information, right? And on top of that, right, the cold, they also became experts at. It's a specific scientific model. I can't remember the name of the scientist. It's named after a scientist. But essentially, you can make electrical gradients from cold, right? Anytime that, in fact, that's what a heat engine is. The greater the gradient, meaning the colder you can keep one side and the hotter you can keep the other side, the more potential energy you can drive across that substrate, whether it's your skin, whether it's a piece of iron, it doesn't matter, right? So that's what I'm saying. The reason why we talk about cold and magnetic fields and why we know it works and why we want you to get a lot of melanin to be protective against cancer and degradation is, yes, it interacts with this DHA and all the other stuff that we've talked about. But really, it's because your cells have this very ancient history that makes those stimulators done correctly as hormetic stressors that make you more resilient because of this ancient history, essentially, of like where you actually come from, and those abilities are still within you today.
Yeah, and this is why it's I believe it's crucial to people who want to improve mitochondrial efficiency and whatnot. So always look on every input that can increase it and harm it, and understand it how it works, instead of like, oh, I'm just gonna take NMN, and you're like, oh, yeah, but what does it do? You don't even know.
Right. Well, let's actually take that concept for just a moment, right? Again, we're going to explain this in better detail in terms of the actual mitochondria. But if you know that your NAD plus is going down, cytochrome 1 is not working there, right? And if you know that that's what's happening, then you by default know that you're making poor water. So instead of introducing NMN, you want to introduce something that will cause you to make more water as C4, right? Cytochrome 4. A couple things can do that. A couple things are food, a couple things are medications, a couple things are environmental inputs. You see what I mean? There's a lot of things that are different. You can combine or do only one, but you can put a lot of pressure on cytochrome 4 to correct the actual problem, which is creating that magnetic field regulation that's going to cause that cleavage of that proton, that hydrogen proton, so that cytochrome 1 can start working again. That's what it tells
And
you.
the way you describe it, I'm like unpacking, okay, I could eat a lot of steak, I could do a lot of cardio. Easiest probably would be drink a lot of deuterium depleted water.
Yeah, you could even couple that with sweating, right? Infrared heat production, right? Infrared lights to stimulate cytochrome 4. You could also, do sunlight, obviously. You could do cold exposure. You could do you could even introduce something like methylene blue, which enhances cytochrome 4, right? Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, there's so much there that is not, I'm going to take NMN.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is why it works for some people and for other people it doesn't work, right?
Yeah, because you don't actually know the bottleneck, right? You're not,
Yeah.
or you're just feeding more of the bottleneck, right? If your NAD plus is low, like somehow you get this tested, right? Most people aren't testing anything to begin with, right? That's really the problem, right? So,
well, they don't even understand why how energy is created. They think I need to eat bloody bagels or whatever. When they
yeah,
look at me and what I do, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna just copy what you do. I'm like, oh, are you gonna copy an hour and a half on Stairmaster every day as well? Maybe you're not.
yeah, or spending an hour at post workouts, bathing out by a pond, doing, checking your email or whatever.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Like, you're not going to live the same lifestyle. So the efforts that, in terms of when you start looking at it from this perspective that we just laid out, right? And so, and the just kind of not necessarily final thoughts, but like to improve on what I'm talking about as far as what mitochondria actually are, right? What they're doing is they are built, right? So this is some of the magnetic stuff that we're talking about, just the atoms that are in the cytochromes that are paramagnetic, and the oxygen and the iron and all of that that's paramagnetic. So magnetic fields are physically, right? This is a key point, not chemically, physically controlling these cytokines and how efficient they are at what they do. Right? This is not a chemical reaction. So that means introducing a chemical, a drug, a supplement is not ever going to change what I just said, everything up to this point, as far as paramagnetic atoms and magnetic fields and electric fields. You see what I'm saying? So if you're living
what you are saying also, at least sounds to me that you're strengthening something that I always preach. Eat like a goddamn adult. Stop counting calories. Start looking at quality of food.
Yeah, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't like the best you can do is make sure that your quality of food is as close to nature and well maintained nature can give you, right? We the thing that you're saying, right, I think needs to be quantified, right? Which is what I'm doing. Good quality food does not mean that you looked at the label and saw the 15 ingredients and said, oh, those, I can pronounce those. That is not high quality food. High quality food, right? We can define it now that we understand where this whole thing comes from. Because remember, the food web on this planet originates from this story, right? So if you aren't eating food that was grown in nature, it's not high quality food.
And I think we need to kind of expand as well what you have said a million times. The food that's grown in nature locally, because otherwise it is affecting you a completely different way.
Because of the local magnetic fields and everything that you just stated in terms of how the structures are going to be built. Again, it's minute, right? I'm not
So
saying
go
like,
find the local most jacked farmer and buy his food.
yeah. Go explore around your city. Take a trip to the suburbs.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Start figuring out where your closest farmer's market is and start buying food from there. That's essentially what I'm saying, because that's going to be the highest quality of food that you can get, right? And then within that sphere, there might be higher qualities, but the entry level is small, is what I'm saying. Go to the farmer's market and buy from there, right?
Right.
Or as close to that as you can get, right? And that solves the atomic mass integration part, meaning you're taking stuff in that isn't being accounted for by nature and being sorted by chiral and structures like cholesterol molecules. Right? And a lot of people don't know this. Like plants make fats and make cholesterol. There's such thing as plant cholesterol.
Mm.
They are also using the same system. It's the same biology. That means that if you eat from nature, nature is already doing a lot of the work, a lot of the chirality, a lot of the splitting, a lot of the sorting, a lot of the clean room maintenance. You see what I'm saying? You don't have to do as much of it. Your body physically doesn't have to do as much of that as your food comes from a source. It's from nature because it's also doing all of these things. That's
Mm.
something that a lot of people don't qualify with the quality food statement, right? I know that you weren't, but I wanted to make it specific to
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And in my head, every time you speak about it, there is so much happening.
Yeah.
That others
So,
probably would get in and like, what the hell are you even thinking about here? Because
yeah.
I'm thinking about what water to get, when to eat, how to eat,
It's
and all these
exactly,
things.
and that's what I'm saying, right? When you start to understand that the mitochondria is this thing that is solely controlled by the type of water you make and the magnetic fields you're around and the atoms that are associated with that and the sunlight, you start to understand that it's actually quite easy to feed or give that engine the right inputs.
Yeah.
The problem with this engine, right, that a lot of people don't understand is it's not one fuel. It's multiple fuels. In fact, it's several. It's a dozen different types of fuel. We're talking about gradient fuels from cold exposure and increasing heat engine capacity. We're talking about magnetic fields and physical movement, right? We're talking about water density and how that increases efficiency. Right? There's a lot of that, and that's exactly what life does. It's had however many billions of years to perfect the act of living, which is somehow figuring out how to exploit every little bit of energy from the local environment with as little cost as possible. Right? That's what life has figured out.
Yeah, it sounds complex, but it's more or less summary is recognize patterns,
Yeah,
you know.
you're 100% right. Which then comes back down to, okay, if you know this and the engine is this mitochondria and it works in this very specific way, then where is it involved? And then you start to realize, oh, it's involved in literally making your neurotransmitters, forming your cells, producing new cells like anabolism, catabolizing new cells, right? Like it's involved in every single process, right? The only process that mitochondria are not directly involved is the act of carrying oxygen. And the reason is because oxygen is a poison unless it's delivered in a very injected way, just like in an engine, right? If I just douse my engine with gasoline, it's going to blow up, right? But if I inject it in a very specific, controlled manner, I've harnessed it. That's what oxygen actually is, right? And that's why your body doesn't have any mitochondria wherever it carries oxygen. And the oxygen only gets delivered through a magnetic and chiral filtering system, if you will, so that there isn't ever too much. The goal is never to give you as much oxygen as possible, right? The goal is to get you the right amount so you make very little reactive oxygen species and make a lot of useful work out of it as much as possible, right?
Yeah, you're describing that basically people need to understand mitochondria depends on so many goddamn things, but that is also why it's so efficient. It can go from food to oxygen to just electricity to like
Photon
that's why
energy.
we as beings are so adaptable and we can live in really harsh winter, really hot summer, right?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
this
The
engine we
reason why
have
we're
is
so
just
great.
absolute hybrid on ridiculous scale that we can't almost sounds like replicate anywhere
Yeah,
else.
you really can, right? Like the human, like this might be a little bit controversial, and this might be something that we, dive further into in further episodes. Anybody can let us know. But this also reflects back history, ancient literature, and stuff like that, right? All the megaliths, all the things that is human history, right? Whether it's documented human history or not is irrelevant. But the point being is we know that humans existed, and there's megaliths and all of the human history that you can recall, right? It boggles the mind, right? As far as like how any of that was ever accomplished and all of that. And then you got to understand that this cycle of like magnetic fields and exploitation, because what I'm saying, right, what I'm truly saying is when magnetic fields are stable and high, you have the ability for incredibly complex things to exist. When magnetic fields get low, that ability gets short-circuited
Mm.
at the biological level. To say it more plainly, if the magnetic field gets low enough, you get really dumb. You start to regress in evolution. Remember what I'm saying. I actually think that if the planet blowing up's the wrong word, if it got lit on fire, right? Like if it just got cleansed of everything, guess what? It wouldn't matter. Bacteria and archaea would still exist because they can put up with radiation and cold, and the whole cycle would start all over again until the magnetic field existed again. If
Yeah.
the magnetic field never comes back, you end up with Mars, right? That's what happened to Mars. Mars is a planet where its dynamo died. It doesn't have a magnetic field, or it's very, 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 very weak. So it can't support life. It had life. We know that, right? We know that it had life at one point in time. It just doesn't have it now. But that is literally what I'm saying, right? If the magnetic field reoccurs, it doesn't matter if the planet burns down. Life will just come right back because that's what actually drives life. And it's just a regression, right? So the things that die off are just the ones that are complex enough that require a floor of magnetic field. Meaning if the magnetic field drops below the floor, you will lose consciousness. You will lose the ability for your neurons to act correctly because you've built such a complex environment that you maintain locally.
Mm.
But so that means that like fish, for example, or amphibians or crocodiles, things that have existed since dinosaurs, guess what? They're not nearly as complex. They don't need as much oxygen to be held into the paramagnetic state that keep their system running. They're conscious. You see, they're not quite that complex enough. Right? Could it, totally the magnetic field die off to the point where they die? Yes, but the history doesn't tell us. Right? The history doesn't. So, and the reason why I'm saying that is this whole thing that I'm talking about the magnetic field shifting and how weakening magnetic fields and all of that affecting mitochondria and living things. People are going to start to hear more and more about this. Most of the people that are talking about that are talking about it from the cataclysm side, from the human side. I don't actually think that. Do I know that it's happening? Yes, the magnetic field is getting weaker, and there's certain places are going to be not as good to live in as other places. We know that from studies and all of that. But the point being, if you know how this engine works, you can start adapting unique hacks, which is what we're actually going to talk about in the next series as we open up the mitochondria and open up where kind of the intervention should actually kind of be as far as like low level, low risk, but high reward. Like where are those, right? Because I tell you one thing that it's not low risk and high reward. A peptide that nobody's tested for anything, and you're telling me you're going to take it for. I'm not saying it doesn't work.
Mm.
I'm saying that is not low risk with high reward. I don't know the risk and I don't know the reward. That's what it is. Right?
Yeah. And for some that they work, they just are the loudest ones.
Yeah, they work, right? But what did it do? They don't have a clue, right?
Mm.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that injecting that peptide in that same person, but in a different circumstance is going to do the same thing. Let's just take, there's a popular one, right? But just kind of end with this kind of philosophical thing of moving toward. MOTS-c is a popular mitochondrial peptide, right? And it's going to be talked about more and more.
Yep.
And I feel like it is actually something worth investigating more and possibly even kind of experimenting with. Now, the reason why I'm saying that and the reason why other people are saying that are wildly different, right? They're going to tell you a whole bunch of things about metabolic reactions and all of that type of stuff. What I'm talking about is the thing that it does is it actually kind of induces a kind of a blinding effect to reactive oxygen species a little bit, and it enables you to run the mitochondria like it's summertime. If you know that that's what it's tricking you to do, then you must provide, even if it's synthetically, summertime mode. That means lots of UV if it's synthetic, plenty of cold exposure, at least on the brain and on the brain stem, so that you can get a lot of biophotons, a lot of UV biophotons. so that you can simulate a summertime environment more closely so that the mitochondria that's going to be pushed into that phenotype can actually start taking advantage of it more and more and more, right? If you don't do that, you're probably not going to get as good result. You might not get any result. You see what I mean? If you do that, or like if you take that peptide, but you don't do any of this, hey, I know that the mitochondria is going to be shifted into summertime mode, and I'm going to do all the things that reflect summertime inputs. If I don't do the input side and I just take the peptide, you're probably going to get some result. It's just going to be short lived. 2 or 3 months later, you'll stop getting results, or you'll start getting, you're going to have to pay that debt because you didn't give it the inputs that the mitochondria was expecting from summertime mode. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that explains why a lot of people who are bragging about it are from California or Florida. No one in between.
You see what I'm saying? Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm fully taking into account that if you know what you're doing with this peptide and you know how to stimulate the mitochondria correctly to give it the right inputs, you can make this peptide to your advantage. It's a right tool. You know what the tool is doing, and you give the thing the right inputs. Yeah, now you're a real mechanic, right? Now you've actually done something that moves it in the right direction, and you probably have a pretty good idea of where it's going. That's really the only one because that's the other thing that is a mitochondrial peptide, meaning we know exactly where it stimulates the mitochondria. That's why I'm saying the things that I'm saying. There are other things that we've talked about actually previously here. They're also called mitochondrial peptides. One of them was SS33, I believe, right? Which is an apoptosis inhibitor. Specifically, it stops the release of C oxidase. That's what it does. It's a synthetic molecule that I don't know exactly how it does it, but it goes to cytochrome C4 and it stops the release of cytochrome C oxidase. If you look at all the literature, that's exactly what cancer cells do. They stop that release so that they can maintain eternal life. In the company that developed this peptide, in their disclosure, it says, hey, if this could cancer is a possible outcome of this type of therapy. That's why I never went past trial, right? Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, that's also touted. You can buy that right now on peptide websites, right? It's a mitochondrial, on the label, that's what it says. This is a mitochondrial peptide, right? That, again, I'm not even saying it's not useful. I'm saying you better know exactly what you're doing if you want to try to use that for anything. You see what I'm saying? Because of exactly what it does. And so that's the goal of the next series of episodes. Hey, let's dig into the mitochondria. Let's talk about maybe some peptides to use them as an example. Let's actually talk about what it's doing and what parts of it are important to do what acts you can actually do, right? What kind of inputs can you actually do to actually influence the mitochondria with a high reward, very low risk, and depending on how deep we take that conversation and how interested people are, we can even rank things like some mitochondrial peptides out there and stuff like that as far as like danger, no danger, kind of what to use. Again, it's not an end all be all. It won't be like a course of after you take this, you know exactly what you're doing. It'll be a course of highlighting the engine and possibly some therapies or interventions that you can intertwine. But the engine is the thing to focus on. How does it work?
Yeah, there's so much to unpack because I know a lot of people use Cellung for anxiety, and I'm like, probably not the best. It's wild. But again, it's what you just described is that understanding that mitochondria isn't just energy production, it's also information control. It's also mental kind of support. And basically everything that's good or bad starts here. And people are looking at a million other things, whereas if they followed what I always have said, move like a child for as long as you can. If they followed that principle, when your mitochondria are the healthiest, you're probably going to avoid a million other things that might happen. You're all kind of pre-diabetes, and all popular now is food noise. Everyone has food noise, and I'm like, no, you're just hungry because you don't eat. Why
Yeah.
why are you putting up a mental disease on something that's natural?
I want to highlight that some. I want to highlight that with this framework, right? And this is why I'm glad that you said exactly that sentence. I don't want to have as much food noise. You know what that tells me? That tells me your mitochondria are telling you that you are energy starved. Remember what we just said in these prior few minutes, right? Food is one input of dozens of inputs that the mitochondria takes advantage of to keep everything running correctly. If you're telling me you're having food noise, that means that the mitochondria have been energy starved long enough that they've already started to hinder dopamine responses, adrenaline responses, neurocircuitry here. They've already started to manipulate things to get you to move,
Hmm.
right? Like, and I mean that fully, right? Like, let's forget you're a human, right? Let's forget you're a human. You're a wildebeest, right? The grass starts to dry up. It's drier. It's not using its deuterium depletion methods anymore as good. The grass isn't gone, but it's drier. It's changed because the environment has changed. You're a wildebeest, you start eating it. All of a sudden, you don't get as much input from that because you're accumulating deuterium because the grass is now drier. Your instinct immediately comes from the mitochondria that are processing all this stuff and all the inputs locally that go, hey, this place cannot sustain you anymore. You must move. So it moves. It is driven so well by this system because it doesn't have a conscious and self-reflection and care about what other wildebeest think about it, right? It just goes until the instinct stops. So much so that it'll cross the river and crocodiles and risk its life and its offspring's life to get to the other place where it knows it will continue to survive. And this goes on for eons. Right? Food noise to me from a human tells me, hey, you are the most adapted species on this whole damn planet. That means you are so excellent at taking advantage of the environmental inputs that you essentially have time to only eat once or twice a day. And that's somehow enough fuel for your whole day, irrelevant of what you do. Right?
Hmm.
Think of that for a moment. That's because you're getting so much damn energy from everywhere else that you don't have to care about the food input nearly as much. Right? I'm not saying it's zero. I'm just saying it's way less dramatic than for a less evolved organism. You can see this all over the planet. Right?
Yeah,
So
we see it.
immediately,
We see it all the time. That especially when we start working with somebody and they start tracking what they do, and I'm like, "How? You're so malnourished, and you've been doing it for 50, how many years?
yeah. So
Wow."
then it totally could be food, right? And more often it's specific foods,
Hmm.
right? A nutrient deficiency, a vitamin deficiency, a mineral deficiency, a fatty acid. You see what I mean? Yes, there's a food component always to this. It's usually a specific component. And then there's this whole broad spectrum of where do you subsidize the rest of your energy? Where's the cold exposure? Where's the sunlight integration? Where's the grounding integration? Where is the physical movement vibration integration? There isn't any of that. I'm sedentary. I stay inside. Maybe I walk in front of my computer, right? That's
Hmm.
about as much as activity as I do, right? But all of the other inputs are missing for that very highly adapted, very specialized, very, how would I say, integrated circuitry into the magnetic and into the Earth's ecosystem, right? For lack of a way to say it, right? You have evolved mitochondria and an organism, right? A flesh suit that is so well adapted to receive every single input from the ecosystem to take advantage of it for energy transformation. When you tell me you have a lot of food noise, it's telling me that the inputs are either missing or they're not enough.
Hmm.
Sometimes that means the environment is taking them from you. Like you live underneath a cell phone tower that's bombarding you with chaotic wavelengths that your body can't take a hold of or do anything with anyway. And so now not only are you being starved of, you're actually running interference with. Right? There is that possibility. And then the only thing is moving, right? There is that. That's unique. That's not happens more and more, but it's not everybody. Most of the time, it looks like something exactly like what we've always talked about right from the very beginning. You don't get out enough, you don't experience enough environment, you don't experience enough nature, you don't experience enough of the real food environment to kind of get your body back into the cohesiveness that the mitochondria requires to upregulate all of its energy transformation capabilities to the point where then eventually your brain just works really damn good.
Yeah, and this is the highlight in the issues that we usually have is like, oh, what is your diet? And I'm like, my diet's not going to work for you. Or where somebody goes and you can just get something from Chat GPT and it gives them an output and you're like, oh, it looks great, but it doesn't fit your lifestyle. No matter what you do, it's not going to help you. So yeah, it's super interesting. And I'm mindful of your times that I need to let you go, but it's going to be interesting when we starting dissecting how mitochondria looks, what's where, how, you're talking about C1, C2, 3, 4, all these complexes, because I think that's the next step, kind of, so to speak, but understanding where this comes from is super important, like understanding like why training works, why should we move in physically and this and that. And then you start developing training plans, then you start developing everything, periodization and so on and so forth. So jumping in like what everyone else does, say like, oh, what's the best workout for chest? And I'm like, how the hell I should know? I can give you a workout, but if your shoulders are messed up, the workout's not going to fit you. You need to understand biomechanics first. So, David, appreciate your time as usual, and we'll dig much deeper in probably next God knows how.